Well, thanks, Alistair, and let me just say at the top what a privilege it is to be here again in Pristina, and what a delight it is to see the Economist hosting this terrific conference. I had a chance in my last job at State Department to spend some time in Kosovo, and I haven't been back since before the pandemic started. So even in that short period of time, it really is remarkable. I was just saying to some of the guests on the sidelines, the energy and dynamism of Kosovo, and I think that's exemplified by this conference and by so many of the people who are here, and so it's really a privilege to be back and see a lot of friends in the audience. Building on what Alistair just said, Nectaria asked me to say a word about the war in Ukraine, which we've skirted around in some of the earlier discussions, but take it on a little bit more in a head-on fashion. What that war means for the Western Balkans, what it means for the future of Europe's security architecture, which has been alluded to in some of the other sessions, and something else that's been hinted at in some of the earlier sessions. What are America's strategic priorities, and where is U.S. foreign policy headed? Let me just start by saying the war in Ukraine, I think it's clear to all of us now, is the most important geopolitical event since the end of the Cold War. The war is far from over. It has the potential to escalate, and I think its effects will be with us for the rest of our lifetimes. Events in Ukraine have been a reminder of what Thucydides called the incalculable nature of war. Eight months ago, the conventional wisdom was that the Ukrainian army would disintegrate and that the Russians would be at the Polish border by spring. Today, it seems more likely that the Russian army may be the one to disintegrate and that the Ukrainians may be at the Russian border by Christmas. Deserve our spirited support. It's possible that Vladimir Putin will use nuclear weapons, but I think it's doubtful that even that would improve his situation. To be effective, any kind of weapon has to be linked to an attainable political object. And it's not clear to me how the use of a limited nuclear strike, whether that were against a military or a civilian target, how that would alter the will or ability of the Ukrainian people to keep fighting to regain their homeland. I think Putin's main goal at this point, as far as I can tell, is to make it to winter, for some reasons that were enumerated in Mario's presentation earlier, maybe on the bet that higher energy prices will dislodge Western support and force Ukraine to the negotiating table. But I think it's unlikely that we'll see a diplomatic end of the kind Shlomo was referring to anytime soon. For diplomacy to work, both parties in a conflict have to approach it with sincerity, and they have to have more to gain from talking than from fighting. The Ukrainians are succeeding militarily right now, and I think their negotiating position is only going to improve as they advance. The Russians are failing militarily, and they're likely to approach negotiations cynically as a way to buy time and lock in their position on the battlefield. So even if there were a ceasefire tomorrow, I think it's unlikely to yield a durable political settlement. The barbarism, the atrocious acts that have been committed by Russian troops has created a generational enmity. I think the Russians are likely to use any pause in the fighting as an intermezzo to rearm and resume the aggression at a later date. And even if Putin were to be deposed, and that's not impossible at this point, I think it's likely that his successor would interpret Russian interests in a lot the same way that he has. But whatever course the war takes from here, the point that I want to emphasize is that Russia's power and prestige have been dealt a very serious blow. The backbone of the Russian army is shattered. The Russian economy has been weakened by sanctions and capital flight. Russian energy infrastructure that took decades to build has been disrupted. And when the war ends, I think we can assume that Russia will be a lot more dependent on nuclear weapons for its great power status, and it'll be a lot more dependent economically and politically on China. All of that has implications for Russia's influence in neighboring regions. Historically, when Russia loses a war, it tends to be followed by two things: flux inside Russia and vacuums in the regions around Russia. You saw that in 1905, 1917, 1989 here in the Western Balkans, and I think that will probably be true today. You see signs of this in Central Asia and the South Caucasus right now. Kazakhstan's refusal to send troops to help Russia and Ukraine, the renewal of hostilities in Nagorno-Karabakh and the fighting between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. And I would have to add the casual disrespect that Central Asian leaders showed to Vladimir Putin at the meetings in Samarkand last month. That weakening of Russian power, I think, will also be felt here in the Western Balkans. Russia's role in this region has always seemed to me to rest more on its capacity for disruption than on the ability to offer any constructive alternative to the West. It's entirely possible that Russia will compensate for its losses in Ukraine by sowing instability in the Balkans. We're clearly at a very dangerous moment internationally. We have a land war on in Europe. We have tensions that are mounting over Taiwan that could lead to an open conflagration. And this is really not the moment for provocations by any party in the Balkans that could lead to miscalculation or conflict. But I think the Ukraine war also presents an opportunity for diplomacy in the Western Balkans of a magnitude that we haven't seen in a very long time. Any leader in the Balkans who had looked to Vladimir Putin as a patron or saw Putin's claims to Crimea as a kind of analog to irredentist claims in the Balkans is now very much on the back foot. I think the war underscores the strategic importance of the Balkans to Europe, including not least as a transit region for non-Russian sources of gas. But most importantly, I think it's a reminder that neglecting EU aspirations in this region only allows tensions to fester and spill over into conflicts that affect all of us. And all of that suggests to me a rare opportunity for creative diplomacy, and we should use that opportunity wisely. The war in Ukraine also has implications for the broader security order, and I wanted to say a word about that. The war has breathed new life into NATO, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A, but it's clearly refocused NATO on its main mission of defending the European home area after a long period of focus on out-of-area operations, and all of that is to the good. But I think there's also no denying the fact that the war has rendered a lot of the components of the post-Cold War security architecture in Europe defunct. The Helsinki Final Act, the Paris Charter, the Vienna Document, the Budapest Memorandum, the NATO-Russia Founding Act, all of those are basically dead letters at this point. All of them were predicated on the notion that Russia and the West could cohabitate peacefully under some semblance of a shared conception of order, and all of that is gone. A lot will have to be rethought, certainly after the war. Ukraine will have to be rebuilt. Its relationship with Europe will have to be redefined. It will need a predictable basis on which to arm itself and create a deterrent against future Russian attacks. Our relationship with Russia will have to be rethought fundamentally in a way that acknowledges the new realities, but also allows us to manage nuclear risks as constructively as possible. And none of this is happening in a vacuum. Unlike after World War II or the Cold War, Europe today is not the epicenter of global geopolitics. The rise of China is the defining economic and strategic reality of our time. So we have to make arrangements in Europe with a view over our shoulder to what's happening 5,000 miles away in Asia. And I think that reality has implications for America and Europe. For America, it means we simply have to devote more military attention to the Indo-Pacific than we do to Europe. According to the Pentagon, the United States does not possess and does not plan to develop the ability to fight and win major wars in Europe and Asia simultaneously. That doesn't mean that we're abandoning Europe, but it does mean that the United States military presence in Europe will certainly have to be less than it was during the Cold War. And I would add it will have to be less in coming years than the Biden administration has placed in Europe since the start of the Ukraine war. For Europe, the situation in Asia means that Europeans must finally, truly begin to carry the lion's share of responsibility for their own defense. Putin's invasion did more in the first 2 weeks of the invasion than successive U.S. administrations over several years in convincing Europeans to take security seriously. We should applaud the decision by the German government to increase defense spending and reduce energy reliance on Russia. But the reality is that the United States is still carrying a disproportionate share of the burden for European security. Since January, the United States has provided more aid of all types, military, humanitarian, and economic, to Ukraine than all of Europe combined, despite the fact that Europe has a bigger economy. $67 billion. That's 3 times more than all EU institutions combined. That's 15 times more than Germany and 50 times more than France. Europeans should not be under any illusions that this state of affairs will continue indefinitely. Joseph Borrell is right when he says that Europe's prosperity since the Cold War has been based on easy security from America, cheap gas from Russia, and cheap imports from China. And he's right when he says that all 3 of those things are shifting. The good news, and I'll end on an optimistic note, is that a lot of factors are now working in our favor. Putin is failing in Ukraine. The shocks from the Ukraine war and from COVID have been a wake-up call on both sides of the Atlantic. Both America and Europe have gotten more serious about supply chains, semiconductors, investment screening. I think the increased defense spending and energy diversification in Europe, if they're followed through on, will put Europe in a lot stronger position in a few years' time and free up American bandwidth to prevent a major war in Asia. All of this works to the West's advantage in what is clearly shaping up to be a very turbulent period in history. We have to be diligent and, as Dr. Kaplan said earlier, not revert to the old complacency, above all in regions like the Western Balkans. But I'm confident that if we learn from the lessons of Ukraine and we make the most of the harsh opportunities that it's creating, that America and Europe will ride out the storm together like we have in the past. So thank you again for having me, and I look forward to Q&A.